Hello everyone, this is Jeff with Mississippi in the Civil War, and it's time for the latest episode of Mississippi in the Civil War, and today I'm going to be talking about the Battle of Harrisburg, Mississippi, which took place on July 14th, 1864, making this the 158th anniversary of the battle this month. And this was probably the biggest battle that took place in Mississippi in 1864, and it was going to have some pretty important repercussions for the outcome of the Atlanta campaigns. So we'll get to it. This battle has always been of great interest to me. I wrote my regimental history on the 38th Mississippi Infantry, which is part of Mabry's Mississippi Brigade, which we're going to be talking about today. And also had a number of relatives that fought in the Battle of Harrisburg with Mabry's Brigade. I had several in the 38th Mississippi, and I had a couple more in the 4th Mississippi Cavalry, which was also part of Mabry's Brigade. And I think these familial ties really help pique your interest in a battle. When you know you had relatives that fought in a battle, it makes you really want to learn more about it, get an idea of what they experienced. So I really hope you'll enjoy this episode. And in a recent episode, we had talked about the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads. FORREST's victory at Bryce's Crossroads in June 1864 had a very strong impact on Union strategy. At this time, General William T. Sherman was engaged in his Georgia campaign to take Atlanta. His army was being supplied via the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad. And if FORREST could cut this vital lifeline, it would put Sherman's campaign in very great danger. In fact, it might grind to a complete halt. So after Bryce's Crossroads, where FORREST had just literally completed one of the most brilliant victories of his career, the threat to his lifeline seemed very real. So General William T. Sherman resolved to deal with the problem once and for all. On June 16, 1864, he issued the following order to Major General James B. McPherson, commander of the Department of Tennessee. And in this order he said, quote, "I wish you to organize as large a force as possible at Memphis, with Generals A.J. Smith or Moore in command, to pursue FORREST on foot, devastating the land over which he has passed or may pass, and make him and the people of Tennessee and Mississippi realize that although a bold, daring, and successful leader, he will bring ruin and misery on any country where he may pause or tarry. If we do not punish FORREST and the people now, the whole effect of our past conquests will be lost." So Sherman didn't mince words. He expected results, and he needed them fast, because he did not want FORREST getting loose into his rear areas and disrupting his lifeline via the railroad. So command of the Union expedition to destroy FORREST and end the threat was given to Major General Andrew J. Smith. And on July 5th, 1864, he led a force of 14,000 men and 24 cannon out of LaGrange, Tennessee, headed south into Mississippi. To combat this expedition, General FORREST had an army of about 7,500 cavalry, 2,100 dismounted cavalry serving as infantry, and 20 cannon. Now, Andrew Jackson Smith, by this point in the war, had a great deal of experience. He was a graduate of West Point, class of 1838. He had served in the Mexican War and on the frontier before the Civil War. And during the war, he had seen action commanding a division at the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou, at Arkansas Post, throughout the Vicksburg campaign. In early 1864, he was promoted to Major General and had also led troops during the Red River campaign in Louisiana. So he was very well experienced and a very good choice for this mission. And in fact, Confederate General Abraham Buford, who would be part of the Confederate forces opposing Smith, and to whom Mabry's brigade was going to be attached during the Battle of Harrisburg, said of Smith's command, "This force was admirably equipped, commanded by an officer of experience and skill, and moved with great caution, always prepared." So just to sum up, this was not going to be another Bryce's Crossroads for the Confederates. They were not facing another Samuel D. Sturgis, the Union losing general at Bryce's Crossroads. Smith was a different breed, and it was going to show very soon in the results on the battlefield. Now, the Confederate commander of the Confederate forces that were going to have to be charged with stopping Andrew Jackson Smith was General Stephen D. Lee. He had Nathan Bedford Forrest as his second in command, and on July 10, 1864, Lee and Forrest set up their headquarters at Okolona, which was thought to be the federal objective. Lee was also a West Point graduate. He was class of 1854. He had a short term in the United States Army out west fighting Indians before resigning his commission in 1861 to go south and fight for his native country, or his new country. Starting as a captain in the Confederate Army, he very quickly moved up the ranks in the artillery branch of service, serving as Chief of Artillery for General McLaws and later for General John Magruder. After serving with distinction in numerous battles, he was transferred to the command of a battalion of artillery for General James Longstreet. And in November 1862, he was promoted to Brigadier General and given command of the artillery of General Pemberton, and would serve at Vicksburg until the fall of that city in the summer of 1863. After he was paroled, he was promoted to Major General in August of 1863 and placed in command of the cavalry in the Department of Mississippi and West Tennessee. And then on June 23, 1864, Lee was appointed Lieutenant General, making him the youngest man to reach that rank in the Confederate Army. So he was another experienced officer, a young up-and-comer. So you had two very experienced commanders that were going to be fighting against each other. Now, in response to the Federal advance, Mabry's brigade was ordered forward from Saltillo to Ellistown, about 15 miles northwest of Tupelo, on July 9th. On arrival, the brigade was temporarily attached to Brigadier General Abraham Buford's division for the coming battle. Now, H.P. Mabry was a colonel. He was a commander of the 3rd Texas Cavalry, and he had been detached from his regiment earlier in 1864 to take command of a brigade of Mississippians. He had no previous association with them, and he was rather hesitant to take over command of a unit that he had no connection to. But Mabry was going to prove to be an excellent brigade commander. He was a strict disciplinarian, but he was also very well liked. He was a go-getter, and I think the men appreciated that. He knew how to lead in combat. He had certainly led the 3rd Texas Cavalry through some very difficult fights. So I think the Mississippians were glad to have a combat leader in command of them. Mabry's Mississippi Brigade that he commanded was made up of the 38th Mississippi Mounted Infantry, the 4th Mississippi Cavalry, 6th Mississippi Cavalry, and the 14th Confederate Cavalry. All told, the brigade numbered about 1,000 effectives. On July 13th, General Smith changed the Federal line of march and turned his men east toward Tupelo. This move caught Lee and Forrest pretty much off guard. They had planned to fight the decisive battle of the campaign on ground of their choosing near Okolona. So the Confederates were forced to give chase, and the pursuit lasted until 2 a.m. on July 14th, when the rebel soldiers found the Federal Army formed up in line of battle to receive an attack at Harrisburg, about 2 miles west of Tupelo, as you can see here with the arrow pointing to the little hamlet of Harrisburg, just to the west of Tupelo. Even though he was outnumbered, General Lee made the decision to attack the Union Army at Harrisburg, even though they were ready to receive his attack, and he was outnumbered. The Federal line of defense ran for about 1.5 miles along the crest of a ridge that gave an excellent view of the terrain over which the Confederates were going to have to advance if they wanted to close with the Union Army. And Lee later explained his decision to accept battle at Harrisburg, despite the many disadvantages. He said, "On this occasion, not to fight would have been to have given up the great corn region of Mississippi, the main support of other armies facing the enemy on more important fields." And shown here in this illustration, this is a modern photo of the monument to the Union and Confederate soldiers who fought at the Battle of Harrisburg. And unfortunately, a lot of this battlefield has been built over. Tupelo, in the years after the war, expanded and has covered much of what was the battlefield of Harrisburg. So there's not very much of it set aside as a battlefield park, unfortunately. So General Lee prepared to attack, and he took personal command of the left wing of the Confederate Army, which would be attacking the Union right and center. General FORREST took command of the right wing of the Confederate Army, and he was ordered to swing his men around the Union left and attack their vulnerable flank. General Buford's division, to which Mabry's brigade was attached, was ordered during the night before the battle to take a position near the crossroads of the Pontotoc-Tupelo Road, with Mabry's brigade on the left, Colonel Edward Crossland's Kentucky Brigade on the right, and Colonel Tyree H. Bell's brigade in rear of Mabry's in a supporting position. And in his after-action report, General Buford expressed the reservations he had about making the assault at Harrisburg, and he said, quote, "I was ordered to move forward to the attack, when I modestly expressed the opinion that the attack should not be a direct one, but the majority of the forces should be thrown on the Verona and Tupelo Road and a most vigorous assault made on his left flank. That a direct charge was what the enemy most desired and for which he was strongly posted both by nature and art." And this is a map of the battlefield that was in the ORs. You can see here I have this arrow pointing down here in the corner. This is where Mabry's brigade was located, right here on the Confederate flank. And on surveying the ground over which he would have to carry his brigade, Mabry had a lot of the very same reservations that Buford did. Mabry said in his report, quote, "The enemy lines were extended across the road from Pontotoc to Tupelo at Harrisburg. He had constructed temporary fortifications on a strong position on the crest of a ridge. In his front were large open fields with occasional small skirts of woods. The ground was gently undulating, affording no protection to our troops on any part of the line. As soon as my command advanced within range of the enemy's artillery, he opened on me a furious cannonade." So yeah, there's no subtlety about this attack for Mabry's brigade. They're literally going forward through an open field against prepared Federals. Now, there really wasn't, when he said prepared positions, there weren't really any kind of entrenchments or anything like that. The Federals had just took the best advantage of the ground they had. I don't think they even had time to really throw up any kind of rudimentary earthworks, but the position they held was a very strong one. And particularly having to cross this much open ground with the Federals having a commanding view of the battlefield and also with lots of artillery support, it was going to be a bloody charge, no ifs, ands, or buts about it for Mabry's brigade. So the soldiers of Mabry's brigade dismounted their horse holders, took the horses to the rear, and then they prepared to make the advance. Just after 8 a.m., General Lee gave the order to attack, with Colonel Mabry at the head of the brigade. They pressed forward toward the Union line. And I wish I knew how the brigade was arranged, but unfortunately I have not been able to find any sources that give the regimental dispositions of Mabry's brigade in their line of battle. Probably just simply because so many of the officers of the brigade were either killed or wounded. There is just a dearth of good documentation by the higher ups of the regiments involved. So the best I can speculate, I think the 38th Mississippi Mounted Infantry was probably near or at the center of Mabry's brigade line. And from what Mabry said, he was with the 38th Mississippi while making the attack. And it makes sense. The 38th Mississippi probably had more combat experience than the other units in the brigade, they had always been infantry up until the end of the siege of Vicksburg. They had seen action at Iuka, at Corinth, all through the Vicksburg campaign. So they were very combat-proven troops. Whereas the 4th Mississippi Cavalry, 6th Mississippi Cavalry, and 14th Confederate, while they had seen action, they had not been in a lot of big stand-up fights like this one. So it makes sense that he would put the 38th Mississippi at the center of his brigade line just as a steadying influence. But that is pure speculation on my part. But according to General Lee's plan, the left wing under his command was to attack first and strike the federal right a hard blow to keep their attention focused on that sector of the battlefield. Once the rebel left was heavily engaged, FORREST would then go into action and smash the federal left flank. This plan was going to go awry from the very beginning. The brigades of Lee's left flank did not coordinate their movements. They went into the attack one at a time, allowing the Federals to concentrate their fire on each one individually, and they were just shredded by the intense small arms and artillery fire that the Federals threw into them. Now, as the Mississippians, Mabry's brigade, cleared the woods and moved into the open, they were immediately targeted by Union cannoneers, and iron shot and shell rained down on them. The rebels dressed their ranks from the holes blown through them by the Federal artillery, and they continued across the killing field that separated them from the Yankees. When they were within about 300 yards of the Union line, a terrific small arms fire was opened on them by the Federal infantry, but they pressed on through this hailstorm of lead. And one of the Federal units opposing the attack by Mabry's brigade was the 7th Minnesota Infantry. You can see here I've got this arrow pointing at where they were located on the battlefield. They were part of the 3rd Brigade, 1st Division, 16th Army Corps. And Captain Theodore G. Carter, who commanded Company K of the 7th Minnesota, wrote a really good reminiscence about the Battle of Harrisburg. And he said about the volume of fire that his regiment put out against the Confederate attackers, he said, quote, "When our 40 rounds of ammunition were exhausted, our colonel caused boxes of cartridges to be scattered along our rear, and splitting open the boxes with his saber, he tossed the packages to me, and I distributed them to the file closers, who gave them to the men. We fired from 60 to 80 rounds per man in all. As we had more men in line, about 500 than the 12th Iowa, the increase in the firing when we came to the front must have been very perceptible, especially to those Confederates who were in the low ground which we aimed to reach." And 60 to 80 rounds per man, that's a lot of shooting. These Federals were throwing out a ton of lead, and unfortunately the Confederates were catching it all. Now, one of the Mississippians on the receiving end of this hailstorm of lead was Private Richard A. Jarvis of the 6th Mississippi Cavalry. And in fact, the fire was so intense, he wrote in a reminiscence, and he said of the Battle of Harrisburg, "I had a close call there. Had my cartridge box cut from my belt and my gun knocked out of my hand by grape shot." And fortunately, he survived otherwise without a scratch and went on to live a very long life. Moved out to Texas after the war and lived into the 20th century. But unfortunately, a lot of other Mississippians were not going to be so fortunate. Now, despite heavy casualties, Mabry's brigade pressed home the attack, leaving a trail of gray-clad bodies to mark the path of their advance. And in fact, you can see I've got the starting position of Mabry marked right here, and then their advanced position about 300 yards from the Federal line. And they moved moved on and got to within about 60 yards of the Union line, but there the fire was just so intense that the men were forced to take shelter in a small depression that gave them a small amount of cover from the Union fire. The rebels quickly brought their muskets to bear and started returning fire as best they could. And in his after-action report, Mabry gave a very vivid account of the fighting that took place in this little depression. He said, I immediately ordered a charge, but the heat was so intense and the distance so great that some men and officers fell exhausted and fainting all along my line, while the fire from the enemy's line of works by both artillery and small arms was so heavy and so well directed that many were killed and wounded. These two causes of depletion left my line almost like a line of skirmishers. And Mabry again gave the order to advance on the Union line. He gave this order to the surviving officer of the 38th Mississippi Infantry, Captain John J. Green of Company F. And Green, according to the accounts, told Mabry, Colonel, we have exhausted every round of ammunition, but if you say so, we will try again with our empty guns. And on hearing these words, Mabry, realizing that any further attempt at an assault was just suicide, he said, we can't stay here and live, order your men back. And they weren't immediately able to move back. They really had to wait until the Federals shifted their fire to another advancing Confederate brigade before they were able to pull back out of the line of fire. And Mabry's brigade had suffered extremely heavy casualties attacking this Union position. Colonel Mabry wrote in his report of the battle, my loss in the hollow and in falling back was severe. Colonel Isham Harrison, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas M. Nelson of the 6th Mississippi, Major Robert C. McKay of the 38th Mississippi Mounted Infantry were killed, and Lieutenant Colonel Thomas R. Stockdale, commanding the 4th Mississippi Cavalry, severely, and Lieutenant Colonel John B. Cage, commanding 14th Confederate Cavalry, mortally wounded. All my regimental and nearly all my company commanders of 3 regiments have been killed or wounded. I was unable to prosecute the attack with any hope of success. Such gallantry as was exhibited by both officers and men scarcely finds its equal on any field. On none has it been excelled. To the memory of those who fell, too much praise cannot be awarded. And the Confederate attack, unfortunately, had been badly coordinated. General Lee's units on the left wing making these piecemeal, uncoordinated attacks one at a time. They just allowed the Federals to concentrate fire on them and just wipe them out. And when General FORREST saw the tremendous casualties that Lee's left flank had taken, he, I think, wisely called off the attack that he was supposed to make on the Federals, on the Federal left flank, and the battle was over. Now, on July 15th, the next day, General Andrew J. Smith decided to withdraw his forces from the Harrisburg battlefield and return to Memphis. His reasoning for doing this was he was low on ammunition, food, and water. The heat was also taking a terrible toll on his men. Both sides also had numerous casualties to deal with. Union forces had suffered 648 killed and wounded. The Confederates had about 1,300 killed and wounded. So the Federals began their retreat about 2 p.m. on July 15th. They marched about 4 miles and camped on the north side of Old Town Creek. At about 5 p.m., the Confederates attacked the Union encampment, but the Federals easily beat off this charge. And then after that, they were able to make a return to Memphis basically unmolested. And this is a modern view of the Old Town Creek battlefield. Mabry's brigade was really not engaged in the fighting on the 15th at Old Town Creek, other than the 14th Confederate Cavalry that did some light skirmishing with the enemy cavalry that morning. The majority of the brigade was with Colonel Mabry, who had been sent with the other 3 regiments on the road leading to Chesterville to guard the Confederate left flank. and therefore they missed the action entirely, which was probably a good thing considering how badly they had been shot up, and also how lacking they were in senior officers given how many had fallen the day before at Harrisburg. And in the weeks following the battle, hundreds of Mississippi families that had relatives serving in Mississippi or Mabry's brigade waited to hear news of their loved ones. This would usually come in the form of a casualty list published in the newspapers. For example, this one here, which is from the J.L. Power scrapbook at Mississippi Department of Archives and History. This is a long list. This is just a small portion of it that listed all of the casualties in Mabry's brigade. And it was very common for loved ones to read through these newspapers looking for these kinds of casualty lists after a major battle. And in a lot of cases, this would be the only notification they would receive that a relative had been killed or wounded. Now, some individuals did receive letters informing them of the death of a relative. An example of this was Mary McKay, the wife of Major Robert C. McKay, who was commanding the 38th Mississippi Infantry at Harrisburg. He had been killed while leading his regiment in the charge, and she received a letter from Colonel Mabry informing her of the loss. And in the letter, Mabry said to her, "With feelings of deepest sorrow, I announce to you the death of your husband, Major Robert C. McKay, 38th Mississippi Mounted Infantry. He was killed in battle at Harrisburg, Mississippi on the 14th instant while gallantly leading his regiment. While nothing can atone to you and your children for his loss, it will be a consolation to know that he died nobly at his post. He was shot through the head and fell in my arms and expired without a struggle. None excelled him in devotion to his family, fidelity to his country, and gallantry as a champion in the glorious struggle for freedom. As his commander, as his associate, as his friend, I mourn with you his loss. May that faith in him who does all things aright soften the sorrows of your sad bereavement." And some of the Mississippians who were killed at Harrisburg received glowing tributes published in their local newspapers by some of their fellow soldiers. One example of this was the eulogy for Captain William M. Martin of Company C, 4th Mississippi Cavalry. And one of his men, who only identified himself by his initials, wrote, "William M. Martin, Captain Company C, 4th Mississippi Cavalry Regiment, Mabry's Cavalry Brigade, killed at Harrisburg July 14, 1864, while gallantly charging the breastworks of the enemy at the head of his company. All who are acquainted with him will regret his loss, and those who knew him best will bewail him most. Schoolboy friends, companions in arms since the beginning of the war, and most of the time messmates, my friendship for the deceased deepened and widened with every hour of our association. Many are the pleasant hours I have passed with him around the campfires and on the march. Many times while the bullets were whistling around him, I have gazed in amazement upon his cool intrepidity under fire and his flashing bravery in the charge." And that's a pretty good eulogy. That's about as good as it gets. And in the aftermath of the Battle of Harrisburg, the Confederates held the field, technically making them the victors. How much they felt like victors is up to debate. Erastus Hoskins, who was an officer in the 38th Mississippi Mounted Infantry, wrote to his wife immediately after the battle, and he told her, "I don't think we gained anything by the fight. It might be termed a draw battle. I think this loss on both sides about the same. And while the enemy could not advance south, we could not advance on them. The enemy finally retreated, leaving us in possession of the field, which makes us the victors, though dearly paid for." And he was exactly right. It was very dearly paid for. This monument that I show here in this modern photograph was one that was erected in 1918 to honor the Confederates who died at the Battle of Harrisburg. And I think the real importance of this battle was in the fact that General FORREST was kept tied up in Mississippi when he really, the Confederacy needed him in Tennessee raiding the Union supply lines. With no interference from the rebels, Sherman was successfully able to capture Atlanta, and no victory in Mississippi in the summer of 1864, no matter how brilliant, could make up for the loss of Atlanta. So I think in the end, Harrisburg was a tremendous loss for the Confederacy, and one they would not recover from. And that ends this little episode on the Battle of Harrisburg and Mabry's Mississippi Brigade's part in it. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a like and a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. It really helps me gauge how much interest there is in making more content. But I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'll have a new one coming out very shortly. But also, if you have any ideas for episodes, leave me a comment, because I will certainly take into consideration any ideas for episodes that you might have. And thank you again, and have a great day.